there are so many beautiful websites out there, and these websites are basically filled with information, and information is basically compounded from the most elementary form of something called as data, right? So where does all of this data come from? I mean, for example, if I said 26 birds, it might not make any sense. Basically, 26 birds is an example of data, but if I said 26 birds are flying, it's basically information that makes sense to people. But all of that is presentation. But the most important piece of information here is that there's 26 birds. So that particular data is stored in something called a database, right? So pretty much database is where all the your information and the information that you're trying to access is located, right? So if you have ever tried looking under the hood and what information inside the database actually looks like, it might not look as attractive or as presentable as you actually see on your web browser or on your mobile application. It might look something as unorganized, or at least at least from the perspective of a non-technical person, it might look something like this. Now, I'm not saying this is an accurate representation of a database, but this is just to give you an example that actually database information, I mean, the data inside a database is not actually going to save information like, for example, the location of the text, the location of the image, and all of that. So how today in this video we'll be learning how the data is created, stored, and then presented to you in the way that you actually see. Like, for example, the profile picture that you have on your Facebook or your Instagram is basically just some text data, like the URL of the URL of your image stored on the database. So how is basically such complicated content or visual representation created on a web browser when it looks so terrible on the database? So let's try to learn that. In this video, first we'll be learning how the data is actually presented, and then we'll be learning how the data is created, and then with the information that we have, we'll be revisiting the information and how the data that we created is presented on your phone or device. So in this video, I'll be referencing two very important things, and I want you to remember the first part is database, okay? And I'm just calling it DB for short. And basically, database is something like your file explorer, okay? Or something like Finder on Mac. All it is going to do is it's basically the place where all the data is stored, okay? In a database solution or in a database, it can only add, retrieve, modify, and do things with data. It cannot understand very complicated requests, something like sending a request to a person and all of that. It only understands things like copying from the data from one place to another place and all of that. Yet all of our applications work on a database. So how does this database actually interact with us? Basically, there's the most important thing, which is called a server or the brain in an application. Depending on the context of the development environment or the company or the project, there may be multiple names for it. The name that I know or I identify mostly with for this part is application. The application code is pretty much the brain of your project. This will actually act as the mediator in your project. So for example, in the database there are a lot of data, right? So when you're actually, for example, submitting a form, you're actually using the graphical user interface. Now the information that comes from the graphical user interface is not understandable by the database, but the server or your application code will translate all of this. Okay, so there are different names for it, and sometimes people will call it application code, sometimes people will call it controller. In the case of some of a development environment called a not development environment, I'm sorry, if you're seeing in the context of something called model view controller, I know this might look a little bit complicated for you if you're not used to these terminologies, but please follow along. Um, this is just called application code. Okay, just remember these two terms. But yeah, so let me actually begin by illustrating with an example. Okay, just follow along. First off is let's say this example. Let's take this example here. A is equal to 10, B is equal to 5, and I told you that the formula for C is A plus B. Okay, the value of C will be A plus B. And if I ask you what the value of C is, I think even if you have no programming knowledge before, you'd know the answer, right? It's basically 15. It's easy because what I told you is I told you the value of C is basically A plus B, and the value of A is basically 10, and value of B was 5. So you just added those, and then you told the value of C is 15, right? But we actually name them uh, by calling it A and then call that B so that it becomes easy when we're compounding different things, right? It's but just remember this thing here. It's kind of the same logic that we apply in the case of a graphical user interface. Like I told you guys, there are different parts in a project, okay? The database cannot understand the language of a graphical user interface. To create a graphical user interface, we use a different set of languages, something called as markup languages, and sometimes they are called as there are different languages like XML, HTML to create languages, but on the database side, we use languages like SQL and different languages, so they don't understand, right? So let's take an example, okay? Of a login procedure. We're not The intent is not really to understand how login works, but I just want to teach you guys how information from a graphical user interface is taken and presented to the database. So in a graphical user interface, let's say for example, there are two text fields. Now, of course, in a modern web page, you can also upload files, you can upload images, but let's take a very simple example here. Now, when you're typing something on a text field like username, you can actually edit the value inside. For example, when you're logging inside Gmail, you can edit the value inside the username field, right? So basically, that's a dynamic value because when you log in, you see a different inbox depending on your account. So if your data logs into his email account, they see a different set of inbox or different set of messages depending on who the person who's logged in. So basically what differentiates is the person who's accessing it, and the way you do that is because these two fields have something called a dynamic value, because the user will define who he is, and the text field is one part where the developer is asking the user to enter his information. Now, in a text field in the context of a graphical user interface, okay, there are so many things that you can access. Okay, what we are interested when we are logging in is only the value that the user entered inside this field. But from a developer's point of view, when you take an example like a text field, a developer can customize the background inside the text field. He can customize the radius inside the text field. He can customize the width of the border and the smoothness of the curve and everything. He can also give access to all of these properties to a user as well if required. So all I'm saying here is that every element, now in the depending on the context of the device or the development environment, uh, these elements, okay, these GUI elements like the text field will be called this. For example, this text field will be referenced with different names and labels. In iOS, we call this every single element as views. In some places, they call this as screens. In some places we call them as tags, some places we call it as elements, and some places we call them as screens. It's bizarre about different terminologies, but in this case, let's call them as elements, okay? This text field is an element, button is an element, okay? You are all combined together to form a website. So basically, when we're logging in, if we want to if we want to authenticate, we need to get the value that the user has entered. So if you're only interested in what the value that he's entered and not the border radius, for example, if the color of the text field is white, and if I told the username underscore field, it's basically the name that we gave to this field, just like we said a is equal to 5. I'm sorry, a is equal to 10. In this case, if I tell you username underscore field dot border color, if I tell you that the background color, I would get the value of the background color in something called hex code, basically hash code hashtag FFFF. That is basically the background color for this text field. But what I'm interested in is only the value inside this element. So I can retrieve that value by using this property called that value. So similarly, we get the value for both of these fields. And then once we get these fields, we send a request to the server, and the server communicates with the database and sends back a response. And what it sends is only either one of two things. That either it will just tell you, either the server will just tell the application that the information coming from the interface, and I've just evaluated it, and I now know that the information is correct or wrong. But the user will not be able to see this information. All it is doing is server is interacting with the database, checking it, and informing the informing the application that okay, well look, the login has been successful. Now, when the user interface gets to know that, oh well, now I know that the application is saying that it's successful, I can say that, oh well, the login was successful. I can print that information. Or if it was wrong, I can say that the login wasn't successful. But I will present this depending on the information that is coming from the server. I know I have not really entered into the actual agenda of this video, which is how is data saved. But this is crucial to understanding how a data is saved. So let's take this very good example, maybe very simple example. So let's say, for example, you want to save a very simple string of text called my awesome data to a database, basically a list of items, okay? So once you click on the save item, what I'll do is I'll take the value inside the text field, which is my awesome data, and I will send that into the server, and I will say, oh, look, server, I want to take this value that he entered from the user interface, just send this to the database. Well, how will I interact with this? How will I interact with the server database? All the server has certain methods that it can interact with the database. All it will say is, I got the value from the interface. Now take this value, okay? Look, database. I have a language called a query language. In database, only understands languages called query languages. In the case of user interface, they understand languages called markup languages. Basically, you just mark up elements in a web page. But in the case of a database, you understand only queries. So all you're going to say is, look, just insert this data inside, maybe after in this particular record or location. And how it actually saves this data, it's something that we can discuss when we implement some application. Okay, basically what it will do is when you save a new data, there will be something called a unique identifier, okay, for every data, and that's basically the identifier is used to locate where you want to save the data. Okay, so for example, there are like 10 items already in the database. The next item that you want to save will have the identifier or ID as 11, so it will go and save in the 11th position of the table. Okay, so how is this data presented when you load in? So basically, what happens is when you load up the web page, you'll see a text or a basically simple UI element that simply says some data is here. Okay, all you're going to do is you only say that, okay, well, look, in this part there will be a list of items, but where the data and what is the data that's going to be populated here, I'm going to declare that later. Okay, so basically, when a web page is loaded, the first thing that is loaded is the template of the web page. Okay, and what you will do is you will define the value as the value coming from the database. You will just populate the value. For example, some data is here is basically just a label or probably just an element. It's just a mark. You just mark up the text. But now you want to say that the value of this text will be the value coming from the database. Why do you want to do that? Basically, you want to display all the data that is there in the database already. So if you do that, you will get the data coming from the database, right? So this is not an accurate syntax of any language, but you'll use some language to implement this in some way. If you follow my tutorials, you can also do this using without any coding knowledge as well. If you're interested to know more, please be sure to go check these methods out. I think if you search each of these terms on Google or on YouTube, you can get more videos on this. Now, apart from these four items, also try looking into something called SQL, and also the last thing I also want you to try to learn is something called MVC. But these are optional things. But the most important thing is to go ahead and actually create something based on what you have learned in this video, so that you can understand how all of this works. That's it for this video. If you like this video and if you found this video informative and useful, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and visit my website at hasho.in, and I shall see you guys in another video very soon. Thank you guys for watching.